Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we chill as we plan my garden. So if you like this video, please remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel, give the video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. So we are going to plan my next season. Actually the season is almost here because the rains in my area start in mid-March. The prediction is that the rains will start in the second week of March, and I've started seeds. I've planned where to get my seedlings, and so this is the garden, the kind of visual garden that I want to have. And so we are creating like a mood board of how my garden is going to look like when it's already planted and blooming. So there are things that I put in mind, and you can also put these things in mind when you're starting your own garden as a beginner or even as an adult garden. And if you are a gardener and there are tips that you use to plan your own garden, please remember to share them in the comment section and they'll be useful to me in this journey because all of us learn every day. So the first thing I do when I'm planning my garden is that I look at how my garden looks like. My front yard garden, which is my biggest part of my garden, is an L shape. So when I look at the L shape of my garden, there are things I like to see when I get out of my front door. And so that's a factor that I look at the visuals, the way the garden will look like, the aesthetics, the way it will look like, whether it's appealing or not. And so that affects what I plant in that space. The first thing is what to plant. I have already shared my must-haves, and once I have decided the must-haves in the garden and also the new entrance, and I have to arrange them and organize them. One, according to the plant needs. There are plants that require full sun, and those that require full sun will go to a spot that receives sun almost the whole day. And there are those plants that don't require full sun. They can be planted in partial shade or full shade. So that's another factor that I take in mind when I'm planning my new garden. Things like spinach can do well in both full sun and partial shade. So those ones don't really have to get to a place where there's full sun. Full sun. But things like tomatoes and peppers, most of the plants that fruits require full sun. So those ones require the hot spots in my garden, and I put them right where there's longer hours of sun. The next factor that I consider is the root system. So you've already seen that I grow lots of my vegetables in containers, and so some of them don't really do well in containers because of the way the roots are structured. So if your plants have fibrous roots which fill the container fast, they might not be very good for small containers. So you have to get a bigger container for depending on the root system of that plant. Things like spinach do very well even in shallower containers, like my plastic containers that I use in my garden. Spinach do really well. Cherry tomatoes have done well. Things like basil have done well in those containers. Then there are things I put down on the ground. Things like cucumbers, okra, pumpkins. Those ones I usually put them in the ground. And also the kales. There are the straight kales, not the curry kales. The curry kales still do well in the container because they are short season crops. So that's the next season, the next factor that I consider. How long does this plant stay in the garden? So the short-term crops are easier to grow in containers because you can keep changing them. Remember, if you're growing something in a container, it doesn't have the option of getting more nutrients from anywhere else. And so if it's contained to getting nutrients from that container. So if that crop lasts quite long, it might deplete all those nutrients and you might have to keep feeding it more often, and also the soil is going to get worn out and you have to change it. So it's better to grow the short-term crops in containers, like the shallow containers that I grow mine. I usually grow the short-term crops, and then the longer-term crops, I grow them either in larger containers or I grow them in on the ground. So what I do is I choose what to grow in containers and what to grow on the ground depending on the length of the crop. So the next thing that I consider is companions. Which crops go with which ones? For example, if I grow tomatoes, I know that basil, tomatoes, and marigolds are great companions. The reason is because marigolds help with nematodes and therefore your tomatoes will be better. I don't know the chemistry that goes with basil and tomatoes, whether on the plate or on the garden, but those two tend to do really well together. The other companions are spring onions, leeks, and kales. I find those ones to do very well also together, and I put them together in the garden. I also do like peppers, and I mix them up with other peppers. Those are heavy consumers and I always have to feed them heavily. So if I put them together, I remember to feed them well together. So the other thing that I consider when planning my garden is crop rotation. For example, the spot where I grew my tomatoes last season, I cannot take back those tomatoes there. The reason is because tomatoes are heavy feeders and they have already depleted their nutrients. The nutrients that they like to absorb from the soil, the tomatoes have already taken up those nutrients from the soil. And so I have to plant another crop that is either nitrogen fixing, like beans. Usually that's how I do it. I will remove tomatoes and put beans and onions. Then I put something else like kales in that place. I don't return the same crop to the same spot because of nutrient depletion, also pests and diseases. Yeah, all those can be helped with because of crop rotation. Then the other thing is climbers and non-climbers. So if I'm growing climbers, I also have to look at where I'm growing them because of trellising. I usually use tomato cages and also use my walls and strings. I put strings along my walls for trellising. I'll actually insert photos of those. So if you're growing something that is going to be a climber, then you have to factor out whether you have somewhere where they can climb. Like you can plant beans and maize because the beans are going to climb on the maize. But what I do is that I find places along my wall or places where I have placed my cages to plant my either tomatoes, like the cherry tomatoes which climb, and the wall I also trellis my pumpkins, my cucumbers along the wall. So that's another factor. And then the next thing that I look at is a shade. If I'm growing taller crops, I always grow them at the end so that they don't shade the shorter ones, and then the shorter ones do not receive sunlight. That way, all of them are going to receive sunlight. So if you're going to grow crops that grow taller, you plant them towards the end of your garden so that the shorter ones can receive also sunlight and also care and also nutrients. The other thing is wind. You check the direction that the wind comes from in your, if you're growing tall crops that can fall down. So if you grow them a place where there is not so much wind that is hitting them so that the wind doesn't flatten all your crops. Finally, the other thing that I look at is spacing. So if I'm growing like spinach in my crates, I usually grow 6 to 8, a maximum of 8. Because if you grow more than that, then they're not going to thrive. They're not going to have big leaves because they are competing for nutrients, and also they are not going to do very well if they are crowded. Some of them are going to die. So you also mix the light feeders and the heavy feeders. You don't put all heavy feeders in one container. You can actually do that, but it's advisable to put heavy feeders with the light feeders so that they balance out the nutrient needs. So I think I've covered most of my needs, my factors that I consider when I'm planning my garden. Then finally, I also look at soil quality. I've already pulled down my garden and conditioned my soil with manure, so I'm just giving it time to rest before I plant. So that helps improve your soil quality. If you are doing a no-dig garden also, you can also put that into consideration. I've tried to do no-dig, but I don't think it works for me, so I just stand my soil before planting. So that's it for this video. If there are things you'd like to add that you do when you're planning your garden, please remember to put them in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching, and I really appreciate this. But please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Always remember, if you have a vision, add some passion. I'll see you in the next one.